These are the 7 most dangerous neighborhoods in New York City history, ranked. Number 7, the Gas House District. The Gas House District occupied the east side of Manhattan between roughly 14th and 27th Street, where Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village sit today. It got its name from the massive consolidated gas company storage tanks that dominated the skyline there. Enormous iron cylinders, rusting and foul smelling, that the wealthy residents of the nearby Gramercy Park neighborhood had spent decades trying to remove. They never could because the Gas House District was not a neighborhood where wealthy residents had much say. The streets around those tanks were dense, overcrowded tenements, home to waves of immigrants and a criminal culture that flourished in the shadow of an industry that literally no one wanted to be around. The Gas House Gang ran the district through the 1880s and 90s. Robberies, extortion, the occasional murder. Nothing organized enough to be glamorous, just relentless, grinding street violence. By the early 1900s, the tanks came down and the neighborhood was gradually absorbed into the expanding city. The Gas House District essentially ceased to exist. Quietly, without ceremony, without anyone mourning it, the gang left behind only one lasting legacy: the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, whose nickname was borrowed from this forgotten corner of the Lower East Side. The neighborhood is gone, the Cardinals are still arguing about it. Number 6, Chinatown and the Tong Wars. Number 6, and this one is criminally underreported in mainstream New York history. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Manhattan's Chinatown was the site of an ongoing war between two rival organizations called the Tong. The Hip Sim Tong and the On Leong Tong fought for control of gambling, trade, and territory in one of the most densely populated corners of the city. The fighters were called Bu Hao Doi, literally hatchet men, hired killers often armed with hatchets and revolvers who carried out assassinations in the streets and in the gambling houses. Doyer Street, a tight angled bend connecting Bell and Bowery, earned its own nickname during this period, the Bloody Angle. The corner meant ambushes were easy, bodies were found there regularly. The wars flared up and settled down across 3 decades. Newspapers covered them with a sensationalized racism that distorted as much as it reported. The real story is stranger and more human than the headlines. Two rival organizations, both legitimate businesses on paper, fighting brutal proxy wars over the same few blocks where the rest of New York largely looked away. The gambling dens that fueled the wars are gone. Doyer Street is still there. It bends at exactly the same angle. Number 5, the Tenderloin. Number 5, and this one gave us a word we still use today. The Tenderloin ran from 24th to 42nd Street between 5th and 7th Avenues, prime Manhattan real estate that in the 1880s and 90s was the most openly corrupt district in the city. Brothels operating behind storefronts, illegal gambling houses above respectable looking saloons, payoffs to police so routine they were practically scheduled. The name itself comes from a police captain named Alexander Williams who had spent his career working miserable low-income precincts. When he was transferred to this district in 1876, he said, and this is a near direct quote, that he'd been eating chuck steak his whole career, but now he was going to get a bit of tenderloin. He meant the bribes, the money that flowed from every illegal operation in the district directly into the pockets of the officers who were supposed to shut them down. The Tenderloin wasn't dangerous the way that other neighborhoods on this list were dangerous. It wasn't random street violence, it was organized corruption. A system where crime was the product, the police were the business partners, and the city government quietly collected its share. The Lexow Committee finally investigated it in 1894. What they found was so extensive it shocked even the most cynical New Yorkers. Captain Williams himself was called to testify. He attributed his considerable wealth to smart investments in Japanese real estate. Nobody believed him. Number 4, the Bowery. By the early 1900s, the Lower East Side was the most densely populated place in the Western world. 1 million people packed into tenements below 14th Street, and two rival gangs controlled all of it. The Eastman gang, led by Monk Eastman, owned everything east of the Bowery. Eastman was one of the more genuinely strange figures in New York criminal history. A short, thick-necked man who loved cats and birds, kept a pet monkey, and was also one of the most feared gang leaders the city has ever produced. He carried a club that he used to keep count of how many men he'd beaten unconscious. He lost count somewhere above 50. His rival was Paul Kelly, real name Paolo Vaccarelli, who led the 5 Points gang from a legitimate looking social club on Great Jones Street. Kelly was polished, multilingual, and much better at pretending to be respectable. Their gangs fought each other constantly in saloons and back alleys in broad daylight on Rivington Street. In 1903, an open battle between the two factions left several men dead and dozens wounded. In public, in the street, in front of witnesses. The police eventually arrested Monk Eastman not for the gang war but for mugging a Pinkerton agent in 1904. The Pinkerton agent had the wrong target. Monk Eastman later served honorably in World War I. He was shot and killed in 1920 outside a Prohibition-era cafe by a corrupt Prohibition agent. Even his ending was complicated. Number 3. Hell's Kitchen. Number 3, and this one is where the New York Police Department gave up. Hell's Kitchen occupied the west side from roughly 30th to 57th Street, west of 8th Avenue, a neighborhood of slaughterhouses, rail yards, and docks that smelled exactly like what it was. The people who lived there were mostly Irish immigrant families and their American-born children, crowded into tenements that lined the streets running down the Hudson River. The Gopher Gang controlled it, and the Gopher Gang had one defining characteristic that set them apart from every other criminal organization in the city. They genuinely did not fear the police. Not because the police were corrupted like the Tenderloin, but because the Gophers regularly attacked officers in groups with clubs and bottles and whatever else was available, and faced minimal consequences for it. Precinct captains quietly instructed their officers not to enter certain blocks alone. Some blocks they didn't enter at all. The gang ran protection rackets up and down the docks. They robbed the freight cars on the 11th Avenue rail line, nicknamed Death Avenue, with enough regularity that the railroad hired its own private armed guards just to protect cargo. At its peak in the early 1900s, the Gopher Gang had close to 500 members. The NYPD had maybe a dozen officers assigned to control them. The math did not math for the NYPD. Number 2, Mulberry Bend. Mulberry Bend was a single city block, the curve of Mulberry Street between Bayard and Park Streets in what is now Little Italy, just north of the 5 Points. By the 1880s, it was the most densely populated block in the Western Hemisphere. An estimated 2,000 people lived in tenements on that single bend in the road. A photographer and journalist named Jacob Riis spent years documenting what life looked like there. His photographs, some of the most powerful documentary images ever taken in America, show rooms with no windows, children sleeping on fire escapes, families of 8 sharing spaces smaller than a modern bathroom. He published them in 1890 in a book called How the Other Half Lives. The murder rate on Mulberry Bend was not a statistic, it was a daily fact of life. Stabbings in the courtyards, bodies found in the alleys, a neighborhood so dense and so lawless that crime simply saturated it. Not organized crime running operations, but the violence that emerges when people are packed past the breaking point with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Theodore Roosevelt read Riis's book when he became New York City Police Commissioner in 1895. One of his first acts was to push for Mulberry Bend's demolition. It came down in 1897. It is now Columbus Park, a pleasant open green space where elderly residents of Chinatown play mahjong in the afternoons. The Riis photographs are still at the Library of Congress. You can look them up for free, and you should. Number 1, 5 Points. Number 1, and it's not close. 5 Points, the intersection of 5 streets, Anthony, Cross, Orange, Littlewater, and Mulberry, existed in its most notorious form from roughly the 1820s through the 1890s. Charles Dickens visited in 1842, accompanied by 2 police officers because going without them was considered genuinely inadvisable, and wrote about it in his American travel notes. He was not easily shocked, yet he was shocked. The neighborhood had been built on top of a drain pond called Collect Pond. The ground was soft, the basements flooded, and the buildings that rose on this unstable foundation began to sink and rot almost immediately. No one with options lived there, everyone without options did. The gangs that came out of 5 Points shaped organized crime in America for a century. The dead rabbits, the Wayus who had a printed menu of criminal services with prices: kill a man $5, shoot someone in the leg $1. The 5 Points Gang, which later produced Lucky Luciano and Al Capone. At its peak, the murder rate in 5 Points was higher than anywhere else in the industrialized world. Not higher than other New York neighborhoods, higher than anywhere. The neighborhood was demolished in stages through the 1880s and 90s. The streets themselves were rerouted. The intersection that gave 5 Points its name no longer exists in any form. The federal courthouse stands roughly where it was. On any given Tuesday, you can walk through the lobby in a business suit past the security desk and stand on approximately the ground where the most dangerous neighborhood in American history used to be. There you have it, 7 neighborhoods gone or unrecognizable or turned into parks and courthouses and condominiums. The city remade itself, as it always has, as it always will. The dangerous places got demolished or developed or slowly gentrified into something else. The people who lived in them mostly got no memorial and no monument. But the streets are still there under different names. The ground is still the same ground. New York has always been built on top of something harder than what you can see. Subscribe if you want more of this. There's a lot more buried underneath.